Welcome to Soundtrack Your Life, a podcast about soundtracks, music, and movies. Each episode features a guest and focuses on a specific soundtrack and the personal stories connected to it. Now here's your host, Ryan Pack.
I'm Ryan Pack, and this is Soundtrack Your Life. I'd like to thank you for listening today wherever you are. Today we have Michael Borowski, Danny Prokup, and Brandon Paloma of the Butter Band podcast. So today we are going to talk about the single soundtrack, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary, which makes me feel really old. It's kind of funny. So Danny and Michael asked to cover this for the podcast, and then at the last second, Brandon was like, "Hey, have you done singles yet?" And I was like, if you can make this recording session, you can be in on it. And I'm glad you could all make it. So a little bit of background: Michael has covered the Pearl Jam album Versus on Stephen Epley's Music Rewind podcast. Danny has been on that podcast as well. And Brandon has a Pearl Jam track by track podcast. So Danny, why are we talking about singles today?
Well, hands down, I think it was one of those, not only soundtracks, but I think it was one of those, it almost was a cultural movement. And now if we go back in time a little bit, everyone kind of remembers singles and the movie and the soundtrack as being sort of like, oh, maybe they're cashing in on the quote unquote grunge movement and all that kind of stuff. But it was recorded way before. It's Cameron Crowe, who, incidentally enough, had Soundgarden and Mother Love Bone in the Say Anything movie, I think in 1989, so years before. They held the release of singles until, everything kind of hit, grunge-wise and all that kind of stuff. But I think for me, and especially for people of my generation, it was just it wasn't so much a soundtrack, but it was almost like a mixtape of almost like the greatest songs that were happening at the time. To this day, I still think Wood, Alice in Chains Wood might be one of the best songs they've done. Breath and State of Love and Trust, and we'll go through it all, are some of the best Pearl Jam songs, and I know we'll all have an opinion on that, but I think it was just one of those first soundtracks that hit you over the head and sort of got the zeitgeist of what was going on and everything at the time that we sort of loved. Regardless of the movie, and the movie's great, but it was just sort of one of those sledgehammer soundtracks.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I've seen the movie since like sometime in the mid 90s, but I say I've listened to the soundtrack at least a couple hundred times.
Yeah, it's just one of those things. Like I think like you had Screaming Trees doing Nearly Lost You, Alice in Chains Wood. You go through it, and these are songs that everyone kind of equates or knows about those bands, but however, they weren't known entities when they recorded those songs or were involved in the movie at all. But hindsight, and then after sort of the hype and everybody's releasing records and all that kind of stuff, they sort of come to the forefront. But it's just one of those, it captured a place in time, and especially if you like the music, the Seattle music or grunge, if you like that sound, this is one of those quintessential, mixtapes, like I said, that you need to listen to and you need to hear.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's best known for being like this grunge mixtape, but it does pull in some classic rock, and it pulls in a Midwesterner by the name of Paul Westerberg, who isn't really known for grunge.
No. Well, and I think that's what's so great about it, because really, if you've been a fan of grunge from the beginning, that's sort of what grunge is, right? It's a little bit of classic rock, a little bit of punk, a little bit of indie, or whatever genre you want to equate it with, and it sort of all melds together, right? But Westerberg was doing the same thing. The Replacements and all of that it's a lineage between those bands and what quote unquote grunge is, at the same time. And I think that's what's so great about it. Before, grunge got commodified and became a catch-all for heavier bands or bands from one region, it sort of brought it all together. And especially when you think about Heart, Love Mongers, Heart is on and they've got Jimi Hendrix and Heart and some of those bands in there. Those songs are only 20 years old at the time when this comes out, if that. But they're bridging the gap between quote unquote classic rock and those the DNA to grunge and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And in 1992, like the Smashing Pumpkins aren't a known entity yet. They're an up and coming
Exactly.
band.
Yeah, what do they just
Gish
out?
came out in 91.
Gish?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Siamese Dream's not even out yet, which obviously bumps them into a stratosphere. And this was kind of, I know for me, it was kind of the first time I think I heard them, even being from like 100 miles outside Chicago, growing up, that you really didn't know who the Pumpkins were. At least I didn't. And then I remember, having this soundtrack, and then hearing them, and I'm like, man, who are these Smashing Pumpkins guys? And I think I went and I found Gish, at like the local like Musicland or something at the mall. And then obviously when Siamese Dream came out, it was, all the videos with Today and Rocket and all that stuff. It was just you're like, oh yeah, I knew who these guys were. But I mean, obviously the stuff that's on Siamese Dream is just, it's better than Drown, but Drown almost sounds like on this though, to finish the soundtrack, it doesn't, it kind of sounds like more like, I want to say almost some stuff, I would say almost from like, Melancholy almost, it has that feedback at the end that's very Siamese Dream, but it just, I think that could have fit a little bit like on the slower stuff and on Melancholy, honestly. But I mean, that's just how I think about it. But yeah, it's an interesting a couple of songs that are not grungy that are on here, I guess from Seattle, especially those guys for sure.
Well, and I think too, those Dyslexic Heart and those Westerberg songs are his first solo recording after the end of, I mean, you can say the last Replacements record is essentially a Westerberg solo album, but those are his first solo recordings that are on this, and they're hands down. I mean, he goes on to do like 14 songs and eventually, those first couple records, but those songs are amazing. So, and obviously they play a very pivotal role, or at least they're involved in the movie. But in my mind, you can't go wrong with Westerberg.
Yeah, and I believe he scored the movie too.
He did. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like a bad Replacements fan to be like, oh,
Except
wait,
for
he scored that movie?
Yeah.
Right. And I think did Chris Cornell score a couple of the songs, especially the stuff that's in the extended
he did.
version of the soundtrack, I thought. I know my wife is reading Total Fucking Godhead right now. I don't know if I can swear, but that's the name of the book about Cornell, and I know he's got some credits, at least the stuff that she was telling me, because I honestly didn't know that until she's like, hey, did you know that Chris Cornell scored some of the songs on singles? It's supposed to be on the extended stuff, and obviously I'm one of those people if it's just the guitar or something. I mean, I want to hear Chris Cornell sing.
Yes.
The deluxe CD. It's got the second
right
CD, and it's got Chris Cornell does have some just guitar stuff. Ferry Boat number 3, Score Piece number 4, but the real key for getting this is for the Pontier tape. which was
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So like the
Cliff.
Yep.
the fake demo tape that Jeff Ament made up song names for, and Chris was like, "Oh, I'm gonna write real songs for those, and surprise everybody." So when he hands out tapes, they got real songs on them, and that's where Spoon Man comes from, and Flutter Girl, which would both find release after this. But it's got Seasons on there and some other songs and stuff.
Seasons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you got Missing, which Pearl Jam has covered, twice, 2 or 3 times live. I know I was at the show in Seattle in 2018 where they actually covered that, and that was before Kim Thayil and a
Ben
couple
Shepherd.
of I can never
Ben
remember the bass
Shepherd.
player's name from Soundgarden. Ben Shepherd. Ben Shepherd came out, and they didn't even do a Soundgarden song, but they did the Chris Cornell Missing at that show, which at the time I'm like, I don't even know what this song is. I've never heard it. Because I don't think that Deluxe, I don't know if that Deluxe
I think
album
it
was
was-
out yet, or maybe I just didn't put it together.
It came out the day after
that
Chris
was
Cornell
the
passed.
Soundgarden song?
So I believe that they played it for
Oh
Chris
my
Cornell.
goodness.
So
Okay, yeah.
But it is amazing when you talk about Cornell. So, and maybe the history of the movie and the soundtrack is, legend has it, and I don't know the truth of it, but obviously Cameron was married to Nancy Wilson, right? And yeah, and obviously was involved in the scene. But when he decided to, so he had written the script, the rom-com, or the movie that would end up to be singles. But when he decided to include these band stuff in the soundtrack was after Andrew Wood's funeral. In Kelly Curtis's house, they all got together, and he was like, "Oh, this is the first time where I'm, feel a part of community, and I guess recognizing what it means to be a part of a community." And then, so when you think about that, so after Andrew dies, you get Temple of the Dog, you get the Amet writing the the Citizen Dick track list, the Poncier soundtrack, and everything that sort of stems off of that, just from not one meeting, but a community from it. I think is really interesting.
So, Brandon, why don't you break down these Pearl Jam songs?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Sure. Yeah. First off, the second track, Breath. I believe they had, it was a song that Stone Gossard had in his demos before the band got together. The do's are in there in the early demos and stuff. And it's kind of surprising when, you hear the song and you figure, oh, Eddie Vedder, he's the vocalist, so he writes those and puts them in there. But I don't know, like the like you're saying, the whole, like Danny was saying, the whole soundtrack is like a mixtape or something like that, and it doesn't really, it stands out as a soundtrack, as a mixtape. It's like something that, like, it's the introduction to grunge for grunge for dummies, I think, that you could like hand out to most people. And then you've got the Lovemongers, which are Ann and Nancy Wilson from Heart doing an acoustic thing.
Yeah, Heart.
And you got a Jimi Hendrix song on there. So it's kind of okay. You got some weird sort of stuff in there, and of course Paul Westerberg. But yeah, the two Pearl Jam songs on here, this is the first time that you'd be able to find them. A lot of these songs, like, this is the only place you could get them in the 90s, like in the early 90s. So it's like, oh, you have to get this if you want the one Soundgarden song, the two Pearl Jam songs, this one Smashing Pumpkin song. And I believe that track number 8, State of Love and Trust, Ed read the script or saw an early cut of the movie and then wrote the lyrics for it. which I don't know. You listen to the lyrics, if you can get the lyrics and read them, I don't know how he got anything out of this movie. There's like allusions to like suicide and stuff, and I don't know. There's like priests, and it's really weird. It doesn't fit with the movie from what I can tell, but I mean, hey, that's artistic license, I guess.
Well, I think to your point too, when you bring up the Pearl Jam songs, like I was saying before, is that those songs are from, coming off the Temple of the Dog stuff. They're early. They're prior to 10.
Yeah.
And so you hear like how quickly that band gelled together and could make, those two songs. And I would argue that those two songs, Breath and State in Love, are two of the strongest in their their catalog. And I'm a diehard fan who, we could talk about this maybe later on your podcast. but I mean, they're standout tracks and they still hold up to this day. And that's only, a few months after they all got together, and like I said, Wood wasn't released before that. It just kind of encapsulates a time and a community, and that kind of brings it all together.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's one of the reasons why I remember buying it at the store, was seeing new songs by Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. Like, you gotta get it. It it had the sticker on like the CD. I remember that it said new songs by them. You're like, wait, what? And by the time you're just so hungry for anything, you'll take it, and you think, oh man, maybe this will suck, and then you turn it on and it's, fantastic the way it just starts out, and the breath just kicks in. It's like, really two great Pearl Jam songs. Danny and I were actually just in St. Louis a couple weeks ago for the show, and they played them back to back, which the only reason they did is the new guy, Josh Klinghoffer from the Chili Peppers, was reminded them that, the soundtrack came out 30 years ago. Maybe we should do something with that. And I've seen the band enough to see those individual songs before, but it was really cool to see them together. And the fact that they kind of acknowledge that, hey, this came out 30 years ago. Let's play them. And for not a very long show compared to how the home and away shows went before the pandemic, it was a rocker all the way through, and having those two on there really just made the show just amazing. Just the fact that they could actually not still do it, but I think it would have been great though if like Eddie would have just played some of the drums that he played in the movie, and they just did a
compliment for us. It's a compliment for you,
because we still quote those to each other, like, oh hey, ably backed by Stone Jeff and drummer Eddie Vedder. That's a good review. That's a good one.
Cliff.
Matt Dillon's character is just, that's why I love about the Poncier tapes is, Chris thought, oh, this is great. What if this guy gets kicked out of the band and he's just busking on the street? And this is like the EP puts together, and it's obviously Chris Cornell singing it. Like, if that was really his voice, I don't think they would have ever been, this guy is just a garbage lead singer. And the rest of the band's pretty good though. Like, those guys are good.
I'm kind of more of a casual Pearl Jam fan, and I have a bunch of friends that are also casual Pearl Jam fans, but everyone will be like, oh, but State in Love and Trust is a really great song.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well, that song is just undeniable.
Well, I think too, like I said before, or alluded to before, it kind of speaks to, if you're a casual fan, I would assume, you kind of gravitate towards 10 in some of those earlier songs. And you think about those two songs, Breath and State of Love and Trust, aren't on a studio album. but not only do they stand alone, but they could and probably should be on a studio album. I mean, they're, like I said, they're still two of the strongest tracks that they've done. And, to say that they were just sort of soundtrack inclusions and, oh, this is the only way you can get it, like Michael, you alluded to before, I think that's why a lot of us went out to grab the CD because of those kind of things. Because at the time, I mean, even though the soundtrack was delayed and all that kind of stuff, but Dirt wasn't out yet, so you couldn't hear Wood by Alice in Chains. Those two Pearl Jam songs you couldn't hear anywhere else. Nearly Lost You by the Screaming Trees, Sweet Oblivion. The release date was postponed so they could put the soundtrack out first. So I think a lot of us were just sort of like, oh, let's grab it so we can hear these songs, and sort of fell in love with it. And then maybe, some of them are still our favorite songs, or we branched out and found the records that those were on. But those two standalone tracks, and a lot of standalone tracks, are just, they still resonate. And I think that's a testament to the power of those songs and the soundtrack itself.
Yeah, I know this is going to sound really nerdy, but I feel like the soundtrack is such a bargain for someone who in the 90s was just getting into music, and you get exposed to all these great bands of the moment, right? Like Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains, and then you get some classic rock influences. You get the Zeppelin cover by the Lovemongers. I mean, obviously the or the Wilson sisters are legends in their own right, but they're covering Zeppelin. And then you've got, Westerberg, who may not be a household name, but people should know his name. And for me, who, was trying to scrounge up allowance to buy CDs and stuff, it was such a great value.
Oh, completely agree.
Yeah, and a lot of these songs are pretty long too. I mean, the average is probably about 5 minutes, I think, for each song.
Yeah. Well, and we haven't talked about it yet, but Mother Love Bone, is on the soundtrack. And we talk about it, they may have been in the movie, but a lot of those songs aren't in the movie. And at the time, when you're selling a soundtrack, or putting a soundtrack together for a movie, you want to incorporate songs that are in the movie, or might play in the trailer that you could promote. And now you've got all of these. Well, I guess I should say, when the soundtrack was put together and the movie was recorded, was sort of before, Nevermind and 10 and all that stuff came out. So they kind of held on and delayed the release. I think, in fact, Cameron Crowe said at one time that as the studio was going to release it, they wanted to change the name of the movie to Come As You Are, because Nevermind was shooting up the charts. And he was like, absolutely not. But then, I think A&M or EMI, whoever, started invigorating and re-promoting Temple of the Dog and all that kind of, everything we know about cashing in on the Seattle sound and stuff. But I think that's what's even more fascinating, is that the movie, the soundtrack, everything was put together before sort of the, as Mark Arm would say, in Overblown, before Everybody Loved Us and Everybody Loved their town. It was all put together sort of as what Cameron was feeling and all that sort of stuff. So I think that makes it even more poignant, is it wasn't put together as a way to exploit or cash in on a movement. It really was a love letter. The soundtrack, at least, was a love letter to a community, to a town. And then it just so happened to be tapped into the zeitgeist, a couple years later when they finally released it.
Yeah, and if you look at the songs that are not on the soundtrack that are included in the movie, you would have a second amazing soundtrack. You have Jane's Addiction and Muddy Waters and the Pixies and John Coltrane and REM and
REM, yes. Thank you for bringing up REM with that.
Yeah, especially when that happens with Radio Song. in the movie. You know, like I think of all when I hear those non soundtrack songs, it brings me to the parts in the movie. You know, when they're listening to the vinyl, when they first like that first night that he kind of like has her come over, and I can still remember like the family affair. It kind of sounds like the record's like skipping with the Sly and the Family Stone song, and that's, you know, it's just cool. I don't know, that I always wanted to like grow up, and that was like my life, to live in that apartment and like meet people, like meet girls in Seattle and like just bring them over and like listen to records. I thought, like, how cool would that be? Like, if that happened to me in real life, and you know, and you're like 13 years old, it's like, I think I'm gonna move to Seattle, and this is it. I'm gonna live in that apartment, and I'm just gonna be I'm gonna be those guys at the coffee shop, and even though I can't play an instrument or anything like that, but it's funny that, you know, that my wife and I actually lived in Seattle last year for like a month on we actually went to the singles apartment complex, and I took like 1,000 pictures in front of it and like to the side where the garage is, and I was like, man, this is it. Like, this is where singles was at, and I can hear the music, and I can see Chris Cornell like headbanging, like when Cliff is like
Blows out the
turning
windows.
up the speakers really loud in her car and blows out the windows. Like, I mean, just like there's something, you know, there was, when I was a kid, there was two places I wanted to live, and one was Seattle and the other one was Chicago. And Chicago was like later because of High Fidelity. Like, and I was in college, and I'm like, man, Chicago's right here, and I love this movie, and I love this soundtrack, and I love um, this book, and it's probably a little easier for me to go to Chicago than it is to just pick up and move across the country to Seattle, because I've been infatuated because of a movie that came out, you know, in 1992, and the soundtrack was so awesome that that was it. Like, I'm going to be a Seattle person.
No, I can't find the quote, but I believe that like they were looking at maybe adding a Nirvana song to the soundtrack, but Nirvana passed. I mean, I just can't imagine Nirvana being on this and being part of this movie.
Yeah, I think it was
anyway.
supposed to be Imodium.
Oh, I believe that became Breed.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like this movie benefits from like not having that huge Nirvana elephant in the room.
Well, it also brings up a good point.
Oh, the soundtrack would have sold millions and millions if a rare Nirvana song.
But I was going to say, it also brings up that good point of how Nirvana really wasn't in sort of the community. You know, they're grunge and Seattle sound and all that kind of stuff, but everybody on the soundtrack and everybody, sort of in the movie, like you have, from Green River to Mother Love Bone, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Ann and Nancy Wilson. They were all in Seattle. They were all, obviously Eddie comes later, but they're all a part of this community. They're all there. Where Nirvana is up in Aberdeen. They sort of, even though they're on Sub Pop, they weren't necessarily in the community. And I think that's, like you said, it would have been odd to have them in there. And I think they would have just sort of been shoehorned to sell records rather than, the testament to a community or to a scene, because they really weren't a part of it. I mean, you can say grunge and you can say all that sort of stuff, especially in hindsight, but I don't think Nirvana was necessarily a part of what we now would consider grunge. I mean, I know that's a whole other conversation, but when Cameron's putting this movie together, the soundtrack and all that kind of stuff, it was sort of, his buddies, or people that his wife was involved in, like Paul Westerberg and the Replacements are on the Say Anything soundtrack, Mother Love Bone, all those folks, and Nirvana really wasn't a part of that scene.
So speaking of Westerberg, there's a in joke in the movie about how I think they're like reading the paper, and the writer's talking about the Seattle scene and how it probably won't blow up like the Minneapolis scene.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Wait,
'Cause
isn't it? Oh no,
what's the
isn't that in
Minneapolis scene?
no? But isn't that's in the review,
Soul
right? Where
Asylum?
he says,
Yeah, that's in the review.
yeah, if Cliff is a big fish in a small pond because he's in Seattle, but if you move to a real music scene like Minneapolis, he'd be exposed because he's not talented enough, right? I think something like that.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, it's one of my favorite scenes. I remember like watching that with my wife for the first time she saw it, and she's like, "Is that Eddie Vedder and Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard?" I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "I didn't know they were in this movie." I'm like, "Yeah." My wife's a little younger than me, so she would have never seen this movie when it first came out. But you know, when the movie came out, like even at the time, like even if you had 10 and I can't remember if Jeremy I think was out by then. But like you wouldn't know if Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard
Jeff's got
walked,
that big hat
in
though.
front of you
He
and gave you a high
can't really
five.
blend
Like
in.
I
if
was
that's who
gonna
those
mention the
guys are.
hat.
But I mean, I just don't think you would recognize them. I know, like now, I think I think you would, but it's not like you had the internet, and you'd have to see the videos, and you had to say you had to have like Spin magazine or something and they were in it for
Or
you
you'd
to
have to have a
recognize who those
shirt.
guys were. Yeah, but that to me, that's what's like crazy, like all the different people that are in it. Like I think it took me a couple watches to even realize that was Chris Cornell, like standing there um with the speakers. Like obviously when they're singing Birth Ritual live um at the club, which by the way, I mean, the way the vocals on that and how he hits those notes, and how his voice doesn't like just shred, like his vocal cords, how they don't like kick off of his body when he's doing that song. um that is probably one of like the hardest singing and like that he hits in like any of Soundgarden songs. It's just, and the power that he has in that song is just amazing. And then singles, seasons is a couple songs before, and you're like, this is the same guy like singing. It's
And to bring
amazing.
up one of your favorite records, Michael, Seasons really sounds like it could have been from Zeppelin 3. Like, honestly, to me, like, if that was a follow up song on, right after Tangerine, be like, oh, yeah, that fits. Especially when, you have the Love Mongers part doing Battle of Evermore right in that track listing. You're like, oh, this makes sense. And it totally, takes me away from Soundgarden, just because at the time it was a completely different side of Cornell. He's because that's Louder Than Love. We're way before not Bad Motorfinger, but Super Unknown and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, during Seasons, and you're like, oh yeah, this all makes sense.
Yeah, and that just paved the way to like all the stuff that you see that has come out now, like on Sirius XM with him doing Nothing Compares to You and Ave Maria. It's just like you didn't know it was there, really. Like I remember listening to the soundtrack the first time and Seasons came on, and you're like, that's the guy from Soundgarden. Like it doesn't even sound like a Soundgarden song. And then Birth Ritual comes on, and you're like, oh, okay, well, now it's okay. This is Soundgarden. All right, this is what you expect. But Danny, you're right. Like it is like how Zeppelin 3, um, that especially the second half of Zeppelin 3 compared to the first two Zeppelin records. If you think about all the Soundgarden songs, and then you have Seasons here, or obviously there's some stuff on Temple of the Dog, like that, you know, he does slow down and sing, but most people who bought Temple the Dog kind of listened to like 2 or 3 songs, I think, you know, like a casual fan. So you didn't a lot of times hear the slower stuff. But this was like the first time, and I mean, and this was kind of like just a throwaway kind of a gag with all the Pontier thing, and it's one of his best songs like he's ever sang. It's amazing.
I completely spaced on this fact, but I found it on like Cameron Crowe's website. The Alice in Chains song "Wood" was nominated for Best Movie Song at the 1993 MTV Movie Awards. For some reason, I find that so strange.
Oh.
I did not know that. I'm just hearing that for the first time. Amazing.
I was like, I guess MTV has just changed so much; it just doesn't sound like it's the same universe, like an Alice in Chains song being nominated for Best Movie Song.
Yeah.
Right.
It is a pretty big swing to open the soundtrack with that song too, because it is very dark and foreboding. You're like, what is this gonna be? And I mean, if you didn't know Alice in Chains, and I think they only had like an EP out at the time when this is all coming out and every like singles is coming out, it's kind of like this is just some weird, this is like something that your parents would warn you about. It's like, oh, that rock and roll is gonna make you pray to the devil or something. And it really gives a strange background for the movie. I mean, like it works when they're playing it in the club scene and everything like that, but if you're thinking about the movie, which is kind of, you know, it's a rom-com, and you got this weird dark song, it's kind of like, how does this fit? But you know, it's in looking at the whole soundtrack as like a love letter to Seattle and everything. And yeah, there's, you know, there's Mud Honey. They were in Green River with Jeff and Stone, and then it becomes Pearl Jam, and Andy Wood was roommates with Chris Cornell, and Wood is written about Andy Wood, and it's all
Yeah.
just this weird spider web of connections that brings it all together. And then you have, you know, Paul Westerberg and Smashing Pumpkins, which, you know, kind of just comes in there out of nowhere, but it all still sort of fits, especially like in a mixtape sort of way where you have to have an ebb and a flow, and you got to have a couple weird ones in there to kind of show your credibility, I guess, try to impress the girls that you're having handing it out to.
No, I was just gonna say when you brought up Wood as an opener, especially for a rom com, you're opening up with it, and it's not only a, you know, stylistically a dark song, but like you said, it's written about, you know, Jerry wrote it about Andrew Wood and, you know, depression and you know, addiction and all that kind of stuff. And it's the opening song to a rom com soundtrack. You know, that's not going to be on Waiting to Exhale. You know, so you're exactly right. It's absolutely amazing that, not amazing, but it just sort of sets the tone to what the soundtrack is, and I think that's why it may have stood the test of time, regardless of what people may think about, you know, grunge or all that sort of stuff. But there's weight to the soundtrack that isn't just sort of either one-offs or maybe fluff or flair for that maybe other soundtracks have.
Yeah, like if you've never seen the movie and you listen to the soundtrack and you hear Wood, you would not assume a rom com. You would probably assume a movie more like The Crow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's got a very Crow like intro for sure. And yeah, especially like the movie itself starts off with Dyslexic Heart, right? And you know, while the opening credits are rolling, and that's not played until, you know, the fourth song on the soundtrack. And especially if you were a fan of the movie, but again, obviously the soundtrack came out before. And say you saw the movie and you didn't know the soundtrack was out, and you're like, "Oh, I'm gonna pretty pumped," and you press play, and it's the guys that were screaming at the bar that they went to that they couldn't hear each other at, and you're like, where is the lighter like the lighter stuff that I heard, during the movie itself?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. If you're 20 something or 30 something in 92 and you're like, oh, I like this movie. It was a light-hearted rom-com. And you're like, oh, I want to buy the soundtrack. And all of a sudden you pop the cassette in and it starts off with Wood. Like, what do you do? You know what I mean? It's not The Bodyguard or yeah,
especially if you don't know Paul Westerberg
or REM.
And you
the other
didn't know
music
that
played in the.
You're expecting to hear like, oh, I wonder if REM and Sly the Family Stone are going to be on here, and you get that, and you're like, where did this come from? And then you have Breath. I mean, obviously Seasons is kind of in the movie a little more, and that's a little more towards the soundtrack of this. Towards the movie feel. And then you get to Dyslexic Heart, but then when you all of a sudden you get to Birth Ritual and Say Love and Trust, like, holy cow, this is just it. It really is like it's a great soundtrack. There are some times in the movie where you're like, I don't know how this would fit. Like Birth Ritual would not fit in the regular a regular movie unless they're at that concert. Unless they go to that club because he comes out, his shirt's off, and he looks like Tarzan, and he's just screaming, and you're like, what the is going on here? And you're thinking this is supposed to be a Cameron Crowe say anything type stuff,
Well, that's a great point. How many? I don't know anybody, but how many dates do you think you could have taken to that club? And that band walks on, and they stick with you.
I don't know. You guys may know this, but I'm reading this book, Not For You, by Rowan Giovanni. I don't know if I have his name right. Givany. Sorry, English is my fifth language, I think.
I had him on the podcast. Little plug,
Oh, nice. I honestly, when I saw that you're on there, I just started out, and I'm like, there's 8 seasons, and it's going to take me some time to dig through
weird songs. That's totally okay.
I need a little bit of time to get through that.
There are no weird Pearl Jam songs.
No, never.
Let's all get that straight.
Never. Yeah. How long was the Hey Foxy My Panel Mama one? Was that 10 minutes? That's how long that was?
No, I think that was at least probably half an hour, I think, because we found the actual Frontline documentary episode where those sound clips and stuff were taken.
No way.
That's wild.
Amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, it showed up online a couple weeks before I started recording. I'm like, yes.
Amazing.
That's perfect, Kismet there. But I thought it was funny that when they came up to Seattle to film the movie, Cameron Crowe took the cast to, I think it was the Mookie Blaylock and Soundgarden show, and Kira Sedgwick and Bridget Fonda and a lot of the women were like, we'll see you later. This is just not our thing. And ended up the night was Matt Dillon and Campbell Scott slam dancing to these songs. And so that's why, Danny, you're right. If whoever sat with you through that date, if they called you the next day, then you just find a ring and you marry that person, because most women would not have just been, all right, yeah, I'll listen to these idiots scream, and this guy's is what he brings me to.
Called you on your home phone and or left them message on your answering machine.
Yeah. I was nowhere near your place.
It is interesting when you said about taking the cast to see show. I remember reading something about the fact that when they were recording the Wood or the Alice in Chains live performance that's in the movie, that across the street at the OK Hotel is when Nirvana debuted Smells Like Teen Spirit live for the first time. And so when we were talking, way back before about sort of the, juxtaposition between does Nirvana fit in or whatever, it sort of reminded me of that, just like how a part of the same scene, but maybe not a part of the same community.
So let's talk some Friends. Because I was honestly going to bring that up, and then we're all like, should we talk about it? And I was like, well,
I just couldn't believe that was a thing. My wife sent that to me. She saw it on Facebook, and I'm like, well, it's on Facebook. It's got to be true. But I was like, man, that's wild. That I never knew that. Like until I'll be honest, until like a couple months ago, and I thought that was bananas. That I'll be honest with you, I never watched Friends. Like I know episodes, I know who's in it. Like I've seen stuff, but I've never. It just wasn't my cup of tea. But the fact that they kind of pulled from this movie, it's wild.
Well, I think too, what's even crazier is like singles and all that kind of stuff. It was maybe the first time that obviously Friends did it to a much larger, more successful movie, but we're talking about 20 something single white people kind of cohabitating with coffee, culture, all that sort of stuff. The parallels are right there. They obviously capped in on all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, but it's amazing to think that the parallel between not arguably, one of the most successful sitcoms ever started from a Cameron Crowe, or at least has ties to DNA, allegedly, not a lawyer, allegedly to a Cameron Crowe script and ideation. Be fascinating.
and their soundtrack also has Paul Westerberg.
Great point. Amazing.
Except instead of going to see Alice in Chains, they're going to Hootie and the Blowfish.
I was just going to say, they go to Hootie. Monica makes out with the Blowfish.
You got Pearl Jam at the end. Yellow Ledbetter.
Yellow Ledbetter is on the soundtrack. Those are tying together. Good, great, Paul.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to mute myself because I feel like I'm going to sneeze again, and I didn't want to like. I really held that one in. Yeah, I even forgot what
the first time you heard Yellow Ledbetter was friend.
So, no, oh no, I was gonna say, what's Yellow Ledbetter? But no, I actually do remember that episode of Friends that they played Yellow Ledbetter. It was I for some reason I've just seen like the end of a lot of shows. I think because my parents watched it, and so it was like I've seen the end of Cheers, but I've never really seen Cheers. I saw the end of Frasier, never really watched Frasier. So I know how everything ends on a lot of shows. I don't know why. Like I know what happens at the end of Sopranos. I've only seen like 3 or 4 episodes. Same thing with Breaking Bad. Like, yeah. Like I know what happens at the end of these shows, but and that doesn't bother me at all. Like, at least I know what's gonna happen, so I can't get too wound up what happens when people die or whatever.
Like doing a book report. You just read the first chapter and the last chapter. There you go. Pass
the Cliff Pontier.
Yeah.
You know enough to have that water cooler conversation. Oh yeah, but that last episode.
Yep. That was
the way it ended, right?
Right. I just know in this movie, I know that I think he gets back together with at the end, right? So
yeah, this movie is why I say bless you when
amazing
people sneeze.
I love it.
It was nowhere near your place. man, that's all. I'm serious. Like that was one of the things I wanted to do in life, was to live in that building. Just, I'm sure there wouldn't be, neighbors were not going to look like the people that were in the movie, for sure.
Bridget Fonda.
Yeah, I'm sure Bridget Fonda was not going to be like my neighbor that I was hanging out with while she was going to fix the water fountain, the fountain in the middle of the place.
And
But
this movie puts like all
yeah,
the Seattle musicians like one step from Kevin Bacon with Kira Sedgwick.
Goodness, great point.
yeah,
And he's now a musician. Or he has been a musician. The Bacon Brothers band.
just
Bacon
Oh
Brothers.
my
it was,
gosh.
yeah, every plays, yeah. And I don't know. I just read this, or my wife was telling me about, like, in the Chris Cornell book, that they were in another movie where they just drove through, him and his brother, in like a purple car on accident through a movie. I wish I would have wrote it down, but like she told me, and I just remember it. And the director liked it so much that they had him record it, or they had him go through it and do it again, that they never used it in the movie. And he was actually supposed to have a part in uh, Usual Suspects too, and he, not two, like they made a, like, a second one, as also, but he turned it down because uh, he just didn't want to do it. And Cameron Crowe said he was actually really good when they wanted to make him be Cliff, and it just, he's like, I don't really want to fall into this, being an actor type stuff. I just want to make music. Which, what a different, career path that would have happened if, say, he does do singles and he does do Usual Suspects, and the next thing you know, he's I don't want to say Elvis, but a guy who plays music but also is in movies all the time, but not the other way around.
A modern day Tom Waits.
Yeah.
So, Brandon, as far as, I mean, these are probably some of the better Pearl Jam soundtrack songs that they've done. Where do these rank as far as like Pearl Jam sides for you?
Oh, they're way up there. I think they're probably, I think most Pearl Jam fans would probably, as far as like B-sides go, I think probably both of these are in top 10s just everywhere. And as far as like overall Pearl Jam songs, like I think like definitely top 20, 25 for people who are real into Pearl Jam. It was just these two songs just came out of nowhere in between the first and second albums, when everybody just wanted as much as they could get, and they're tracking down all of the $20 import singles, trying to get those other rare B-sides and stuff, and then even with this, with Chloe Dancer, Crown of Thorns, I mean, that's Mother Love Bone, and it's kind of the evolutionary in the family tree of Pearl Jam there too, where if you didn't track down that Mother Love Bone CD as well, trying to get everything you could, then you got this too. And then Pearl Jam has started playing this song too, which kind of is, I think, a huge tribute to Andy Wood, and also to their history as a band, and to Seattle as a whole.
Yeah, and I hate to say this, but I mean, Apple from Mother Love Bone really is, to me, it's like this song and like maybe one or two other songs. It's very glam rock ish to me, anyways. And maybe they would have, grown as a band if he would have been alive. But this song is, I mean, this hands down is their best song. Like, not even a question in my mind. And then the fact when they, Pearl Jam started covering it was pretty cool to, like, especially for those guys. I know they mentioned that when we were at the show in St. Louis, they've been in a band with each other, Stone and Jeff, since '83. They said, or '84, or just
Yeah,
even
something like that.
Yeah, which, that's wild that those those guys. I mean, I know Danny that long, you know, and my parents and stuff. There's not a lot of people I know that long in my life. It's the fact that these two guys have been playing music with each other for that long. It's crazy.
Well, I will say what's amazing about Chloe Dancer, and Crown of Thorns, that that's actually in the movie. Say Anything. It's not on the soundtrack. But Cameron Crowe plays it during Say Anything, then turns around and has it on the single soundtrack. So again, pointing to sort of testament of his involvement with the community and the people involved with it, and the power of that song.
Do we have any other thoughts on this soundtrack?
I would say that I wouldn't mind if they had like a super duper deluxe edition and they put the rest of the songs that were in the movie, you know, on the soundtrack. I think that would be kind of a nice, cool little bump. I mean, obviously, you can never have every song that a movie has like on a soundtrack. It's not Forrest Gump, you know. I mean,
The Big Chill.
Forrest Gump, like every song, yeah, like every song that's on there, that's it. We're putting it on there. It doesn't matter. We're gonna make it a double disc, and everyone's gonna love it, even though they, at the time, you know, that movie came out in '94. Everybody has all these songs already, but we're gonna put it on a. I think that's what makes this one such a good soundtrack, and a lot of the soundtracks from the '90s, because there was songs that you couldn't get on albums, and I know it was kind of, obviously it's kind of a cash grab a little bit, but it was kind of cool that these songs were on this soundtrack, and it also like even brought you to like, you know, I knew Jimi Hendrix, but I never knew May This Be Love. Like I didn't know that song. You know, my dad had the greatest hits of Jimi Hendrix, so I didn't know it wasn't a greatest hit, you know, and obviously Drown, you know, from the Pumpkins, and it brought me, and it made me learn about Screaming Trees and Mudhoney, so I didn't know who those guys were. And you know, like at first I didn't know who the hell the Love Mongers were, and then I'm like, man, that voice really sounds familiar. And you know, when you're like 12, 13 years old, like you're not the music scholar that I am today, you know, but it's funny, and I actually mentioned this in Steve's podcast about Led Zeppelin 3. I'm like, nobody really did a really good Led Zeppelin cover, you know, because that's how good of a band they are, and completely forgot about, you know, this song. And then, I mean, because it's so good, and Ann Wilson's voice is just like perfect for any Led Zeppelin song. Also, I would have loved to hear Chris Cornell do, you know, just a whole Led Zeppelin album, like just covered, like just a whole album of covers by Led Zeppelin, just because his voice is, you know, so about as close as you know. In my mind, it's better than Robert Plant's, but like Robert Plant, like in the '70s, it's kind of hard to touch him, like as a vocalist. But that's just like my opinion, man.
Yeah, somebody's probably put all the songs that weren't on the soundtrack but that were in the movies, like in a Spotify playlist or something like that, probably.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have one in Apple Music for sure. Like the real single soundtrack. I should put it in order, like how it goes to the movie, the next time I watch it, because I actually still do watch it. I have it on Blu-ray. It's one of my top 10 favorite movies of all time. So I legit, I know some people think it's kind of dated and it's not the best Cameron Crowe movie, but I've always just loved that movie because it's just such a great love letter to Seattle, even though I never grew up there or anything, but having been there, you know, 6 or 7 times in my life and lived there for a month, it's just cool to like see all the different, you know, clips and everything of the city.
Well, thanks, Michael, Danny, and Brandon for being on the podcast. It was really fun talking singles with you guys.
Yeah, thanks for letting us come on.
Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having
me.
You guys got anything to plug? Plug away.
we can both plug Steve's show at the same time, since I think we're trying to break the record to be the most on there. We've so far been on his 90s Rewind and his live stream. We're supposed to have another live stream in about 2-3 weeks. The last one was just kind of let's talk about the first 2 seasons of Music Rewind with a couple other guests. Thought it went pretty well. But yeah, so check out Music Rewind, and it's just a couple of normal guys.
I host the Better Band Pearl Jam podcast. It's a track by track podcast. We go through all the songs. I have guests and from out in the world. And if anybody wants to listen or contact me at betterbandpod.com and betterbandpod@gmail.com if you want to come on the show and dork out about Pearl Jam with me.
Now that I know this is a thing, you might be hearing from.
Oh hell yeah! Always looking for new guests.
Dick over there.
I'm about to start talking avocado, and I got a couple of lost dogs left too. I still need to cover.
I will just say, as an aside, Brendan, Michael and I,
Nice.
We signed up for the 10 Club. We were at a card table in our grandparents' house. It was like a get-together, family get-together. What holiday it was. And we had the liner notes of the 10 cassette.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a P.O. box. And we sent in a letter to join the 10 Club at that time. So like 93, we've been in it. So definitely respect your pod.
Yeah, and honestly, you're not at Future Days yet, so that is actually my wedding song to my wife.
My wife and I are married. Thanks for clarifying.
To that one, so yeah, it's late here, man. I'm getting confused with all this hocus pocus behind me.
Well, thanks everyone. There's also a great episode on singles from our friends at Society of Neogenics podcast. They also have Citizen Dick t-shirts. So, mad respect
Nice.
to our friends Lily and Hannah across the pond. But yeah, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is SoundtrackCast, Twitter is Soundtrack_your, and we also have a Patreon at patreon.com/SoundtrackCast. If you enjoyed this episode, which you should have because it was great, subscribe to the podcast, give us a nice review, and check out Brandon's podcast and check out Steven's podcast, which may eventually just become Steven, Mike, and Danny's podcast.
To be fair, we talk almost every day about music. So. And I think, honestly, if you ship this over to him when you're done, I know he was excited to push it because I know he's not going to start recording. I think, what do you say, Dan, until like the beginning of 2023 or even November. So he's been trying to fill up some space to, keep listeners.
He told me you guys were terrified that I might get Matt Pinfield to do singles instead of you guys.
Well, hey, I think Matt Pinfield might have a little more clout than 2 guys from Chicago.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, though, Ron. This was fun.
Yeah, that was fun. Well, I'll let you guys know when it's ready to go, and thank you for your time. I know that you guys are a couple hours ahead, so thanks for staying up late. And then Brandon,
yeah, you too.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, no, I've seen you on the interweb.
Yeah, you too. And then it's kind of like, oh yeah, and then with Lily and Hannah too, and I've had them on mine as well. Yeah,
they're the best. But have a good night, you guys, and once again, thanks for joining.
All right, thank you. Good night.
Thanks again. Bye, guys.
All right, thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us this week on Soundtrack Your Life. Make sure to visit our website, soundtrackyourlife.net, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too.